gur míle mágad agus seo an dara deise tá agam bheith páirteach sa díospóireach seo agus ní mór do marrá níl muile bith ar mar cuid ferge nó mar cuid dímá. Tá rud é níos measa na mar a cheap mé, cos tá bhhad níos mód an túrascáil léite agam, agus tá sé damananta a maithasama go bhfuil sé ráite ag an comisiún go bhfuil an cuid den ionise ó na daine a bhís na héanad máthracha seo, go bhfuil cuid den ionise trúlaithe. Brenny ar an focail sin trúlaithe. Níor thula mé riomh an focail sin úsáiste mar sin maidir le fianaise. Minister, this is my second time to take part in this debate, and I have to say my anger has increased and my sense of despondency. And once again, I take courage in my hand for the privileged position that I have and the decent salary to speak up. And if you want to put the survivors, and I absolutely hate that word, but I'm going to use it because I think they've used it themselves, to the fore, then you might explain how there was a leak. You've had time to investigate it. You might explain how they haven't got a copy of the full report yet. You might explain how the TDs didn't have an executive summary last week when they spoke in the Dáil. Do you think you could do that? It's not included in your speech. You might confirm that the full testimonies of those who had the courage to go before the Commission and the Confidential Committee will be given a copy of their full testimony. Now, could you do that? Because that would be a start. You might publish the report of the Collaborative Forum. You mention it in your speech. You mention setting up, God help us, a new interdepartmental committee. Lord, protect us from interdepartmental committees. But you've set it up, but you're going to set it up and you're going to engage with the Collaborative Forum. Perhaps you might publish their report. The recommendations were published in April 19, but not the report. And perhaps you might balance the power between an interdepartmental committee with no representation from a Collaborative Forum or from the survivors and the Collaborative Forum and the people on the ground. You might confirm that you will make full copies available to all of us who want them, beginning with the survivors on the ground. You might explain how 23 million was allocated, half of which was used last October, but hasn't been used to print a single copy out. You might say that you made a mistake in having a webinar without given the reports out in the first place. So enough on that for the moment. I will now look at the report. And let me just say that when this report talks about all of society, I'm going to quote a philosopher for a change in this stall rather than a poet. And when you attribute blame in that manner, then you have no responsibility. It was something I touched on last week. So I'm going to quote Hannah Arendt in a different context, but the words are equally applicable to this report. The one who says we are all guilty, and this indeed was the case in Germany, then the person who says this is thereby unknowingly covering up for the ones who did it. And that's why you shouldn't generalise this guilt, because you do nothing but cover up for the guilty. Now, the word unknowingly, I don't think it's unknowingly that this finding has been laid out in the report. I look at page 2 of this report. Let me say, and if anybody has read this report, the 3,000 pages, I bow down. It's not possible. I have read, and I've spent hours at it, about 500 to 600 pages. I've read the whole executive summary and what I was given by your department. I have read the chapter on Tuam, the statistical analysis of Tuam, the chapter on discrimination, the chapter on vaccines, which I hope I have time to come back to. And I glanced at a few other chapters, and it has taken hours and hours. So you're here today with a speech, and I welcome some of it in relation to the steps for urgent legislation and access to records and access to birth certificates. They're basic human rights. We didn't need a report to tell us that, but I welcome that. But when you're doing other recommendations without even listening to the people on the ground who haven't had a chance, then I would say you're doing exactly what was done to these mothers and children before. You're patronising them and you're continuing on with the patriarchal mode. So let's just halt that for a minute. Let's do what the government should do, which is legislation and access to records. And of course, set up an archive and so on. But bear in mind that the National Archives have been under-resourced for years. Bear that in mind when you're talking about this. Tell us, are you distinguishing now, is it just the 18 institutions, or are they all of the institutions where mothers and babies were kept? In relation to this report, the report tells us it's unrepresentative because it's only a sample, and that's very good. And that then should guide their conclusions, but they seem to have not followed that. So we have an unrepresentative sample, and then they make very strong conclusions. Now, those conclusions are completely at odds with the witness testimony. And then they add insult to injury by, on page 12, they have a beautiful picture, autumnal colours. The colour disappears very quickly when you read the witness testimony. And that witness testimony jumps off the page. Sexual abuse, rape, babies taken, a complete absence of any sense of understanding of the bond between mother and child. And that's set out and it jumps off the pages, Minister, and that should be preserved and acted upon. But the conclusions, there was no evidence of forced adoption, couldn't possibly accept that. No evidence of pressure to put them into mother and baby homes. And we have Deputy O'Callaghan here today reinforcing that myth that it was society. It wasn't society, it was the powerful in society. It was led by the church. And I'm not here to scapegoat nuns, because the nuns reported to the bishop, who reported to the archbishop, who reported to Rome. And what did our government do? Bow down in deference. What did our local authorities do? You've mentioned it yourself today. The county managers had a hugely powerful role. So all of that is set out, and then we're told that the evidence from some of those that came forward, only the residents, mind you, is contaminated. Sinan Focal, truly. Can you imagine telling people who had the courage to come forward that some people gave evidence that was contaminated? Now I ask you, how many is some? In what way was their evidence contaminated? And equally, was the same measuring stick used to the professionals that came before the Commission? The doctors, did they come forward? The priests that came forward? The nuns that came forward? The social workers that came forward? The witnesses from the County Council? You know why it was contaminated? Because the residents, the former residents, spoke to each other. Presumably the nuns did, presumably the county managers did, but their evidence wasn't contaminated. Now, I'm not sure if you read it, because I'm openly telling you I haven't read 3,000 pages, although our former president tells us that she read it, and as a result of reading it, she tells us it's scholarly and profound. I absolutely, with the greatest of respect, fundamentally disagree that this is scholarly and profound. And if somebody has read 3,000 pages, then they must have had the report before you ever published it. So we'll again look at the conclusions. There's a conclusion in relation to vaccine trials, and Deputy Dennis Nocton went through this forensically today. I've read that chapter. And then there's a little chapter included, a paragraph in the summary, that tells us that it didn't comply with the regulation at the time, it didn't comply with the law at the time, but you know what? Magically, there were no ill effects. Now, if you read the chapter on vaccines, you see children getting sick with diarrhoea, convulsions, and so on, not to mention 10,000 deaths at a minimum. And this commission of 3 people tell us there were no side effects. They don't even pose a question. Could there have been? They don't pose a question, did more money pass hands? It's pointed out that it went to the doctors. Did more money pass hands? And what about the other trials? We only looked at 7 here with these institutions. Were there trials in other institutions? Do you think that the commissioners might have raised a question in relation to that? Could you answer for me, did any of the 3 commissioners sit and listen to the 500 and something residents that came before the confidential committee? I know there was a tiny overlap between some residents who went to both. It's less than 100. Did the commissioners sit in? Do you know what this reminds me of? Paint by numbers. Do you remember that, Minister? Paint by numbers. You were allowed a little discretion in what colour you put into the number, but the picture was predetermined. Now, the picture was predetermined here because on page 2, the commissioners tell us that they might disappoint somebody that they're going against the prevailing narrative. That is absolute insult on top of injury, because they confirm the prevailing narrative of the powerful, and the prevailing narrative is all society was to blame. So they add insult to injury by even twisting language more. Now, you have one golden opportunity to lead, Minister. You have one golden opportunity to have transformative action and transformative language. And I will back you every step of the way, but you've got to lead. You've got to break away from the 4.5 pages that you gave here today. That's more of the same. It's a mixture of good and a mixture of bad that confirms the narrative. So go ahead with the legislation that you're promising as quickly as possible. But let's stop putting in a memorial to a Miss Litster. And I've seen the good work she did. But the memorial should be to examine how that good woman failed to get any action. And I'll finish, Chairperson. Let's remember Michael Viney back in the 60s. Let's remember Mary Raftery, Connolly O'Fahirta, Mike Mylott, RTE's role. Let's remember all of that. Let's remember Catherine Corliss. So before we jump in prematurely to honour one woman, let's do it in a different way. Let's ask how, despite all of those good people, that the system still persisted of utter cruelty. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy.